Hey guys, how's it going? I'm the Duke of Italy, your favorite lo-fi music YouTuber, and welcome to the final installment for the year of the Math Rock chart. I know it's taken me forever, and I don't really have an excuse. I don't adore Math Rock, so it's not something that's super easy to cover. This chart is also the biggest chart I've covered so far. But you might be wondering, Duke, why is this the last one for the year? Why specify that? It's because it's not the last video. Next video will be the last one of the chart. I'll probably cover that in February, and I know that's a bit of a long time from now, but I have content planned for the entire rest of October, as well as the entirety of November, which I'm really excited to announce probably towards the end of October, maybe even like Halloween or something like that, but I'll probably do that before then. And then, of course, I do Classics Month for December, and then Genre January in January, which I'm also really excited for. I've kind of planned this like a year in advance, and I've literally missed like 2/3 of the content that I wanted to upload this year. So that's just my mild disclaimer of why I'm so behind on everything. I mean, college hit me pretty hard, I'm not going to lie. So that's kind of where I'm at. But you know what? I don't want to give any excuses or anything, because either way, I listened to some Math Rock, and you might be noticing a new little addition to the back there. The King Crimson vinyl. That is mine. No, I don't have a vinyl player, but my roommate does. I bought that like 2 years ago because at an antique store they had In the Court on vinyl, and it's not in perfect condition. There's a skip, but just wanted to mention that because I don't know if it's an original copy, but it's certainly an older copy. So I just thought that's interesting. But either way, let's get into some Math Rock. Today's content, we kind of round off the little jazzy section. We only really have like one more album there, and then we get into the origins of Math Rock, which sounds weird, I know, like, and that's a big flaw about this chart, is that this part is all the way on the top right. It kind of implies to get that last. In my opinion, I'd have all of these albums on the other side of the chart, because with the last one I'll be talking about today, it flows more than perfectly into American football. I think if you just say slightly less angry and loud, then you get American football from the last album I'll talk about today. But before we even get to that section, we got to end out the jazzy stuff. And that's with the more medieval moniker. And at first you probably read that and you're like, what on earth does that even mean? This is Secular Works by Extra Life. This was made by one of the guys that collaborated a whole lot with ZS, or he was in the group rather, and he went off to make this band that wasn't kidding. They make medieval sounding math rock, and the way they use guitars and all their instruments, really, a lot of them are a little more like orchestral based, but there is electric guitar here, and the way it's plucked and strummed sounds medieval. It's like modal. It's weird sounding. He does this one vocal technique, the vocalist, where he takes the last like vowel, the last syllable rather of his word, and he'll pitch it up in different ways, which you'd hear on like Jethro Tull, for example, like more medieval sounding music, like intrinsically. So super like weird style, but like you actually get like a really solid, kind of chaotic sounding release here. The last 2 minutes of Blackmail Blues has a whole bunch of really hypnotic syncopation that actually shows up on the rest of the album too. The song I Don't See It That Way is oppressive, oppressively dark, and just really atmospheric, which for a medieval math rock album sounds like it wouldn't really be easy, but they manage it. Also, the pacing is super varied. You have your longer cuts here that go between all sorts of different sections, and your more like tighter breakdowns. I think this is a great album. Really interesting release. Not my favorite on here, but it is certainly one to behold. It's certainly an interesting one. Now, going back to Cryptology by Yowie, we go down here to similar with vocals into the female and male variants. Female being Gorilla Toss's self-titled album. Now, this album I nearly gave up on because I couldn't find it anywhere except for a YouTube playlist. And sure, that's not an ideal way to listen to it, but this was actually awesome. And Gorilla Toss, I kind of listened to a little bit of their other material because I wasn't too familiar with it. It's a lot more like alt rock, really a lot more conventional sounding. But don't take that as like a really a detraction of their sound because it's not generic and it's actually pretty inspired stuff. The thing is, Gorilla Toss's self-titled record, or GT to some, is insane. It's just off the walls noise, math rock, insane breakdowns, and just the most bizarre rhythms. It feels almost completely senseless for a bit, and just like it's ripping at the seams. It's like if No Wave had regular polyrhythms and like a tighter performance. Like, this isn't like Swans' early stuff, or even like Cunning Stunts for that example. I nearly said the way the joke that the band made there, but it's a really, really tight and fast-paced performance. It's really beating you down. Hints of industrial here too, especially with the atmosphere. And the vocals are dope. They range from like this panicked sound to completely oppressive, almost like Alexis Marshall-y, but for a woman. Some tracks like Drip Decay have these really grounded grooves that tie the whole track together. Diluted Fetus Circus Tycoon has the most insane progression. It's really taking you on a huge ride towards the end of the album. This album is super fun. I think the only gripe anyone could have with it is they could deem the vocals as annoying. I could see that, hence I just mentioned that without anyone else mentioning it before. But you can really get with it, and it works with the atmosphere and the message they're trying to portray here. This is a really well done album. It's fun, and I say it's great too. Now, the male version of this is Second Wave by the band Gay Beast. Now, I was happy about this album, not for the title or anything, but because it was short. It was 30 minutes, and even better, it was easy to find. It was on Spotify, like where most of these aren't. Most of these you have to search low and high, but this one was right in front of me. Thank goodness. It's this electronic slathered math rock that takes this chaotic playing and condenses it into these really tight tracks. And one of the highlights of this album is the horn section. Sounds a bit Mel Collins in the way that it gives you a lot of tension. Mel Collins from King Crimson. I think the song Xerox was a bit lame. I thought lyrically it really didn't deliver at all. But I thought White Diamond was the opposite of that. I think that song was actually really great. But I thought this album was good. If you want to be a completionist, totally give this a shot. Maybe it's not the band's best album, but I thought it was pretty solid. And now, scrap the jazzy side. We've gone through those albums for today. We go all the way back to the beginning of the chart, Spiderland. And then, if you like the grit, you go down to Shellac at Action Park. So this is Steve Albini's other group that isn't Big Black, as well as a few other groups he's played in. But Steve Albini has pretty much most of his modern material with this group. They're kind of mathy, very instrumental focused, very post-hardcore punky. So very traditional math rock in the punky style. So if that's what you're into, you're going to love Shellac. This is very groovy stuff. It's got a thick bass sound, and the guitar harshly contrasts against that because it's just crunchy, super crunchy sound. Like it's like gravel in your ears. It's very angry sounding. Above all, this is like a solid intro to math rock. This is one of those I'd put sort of towards the beginning. And again, I mentioned this section. Historically speaking, this is where you'd want to start for math rock. It shows where like how emo and math rock sort of ride the same wave until they break out at the same time. I think the song Crow has a monstrous build and has a similar tension to Spiderland, which Steve Albini, he didn't produce, but he certainly influenced because he produced Tweeze. A lot of great tracks here. I prefer the more winding ones, even though they're a bit sparse, but I think overall this is a solid release. I would give this a great. Steve Albini typically knows what he's doing, which leads me to an album he produced, Tweeze by Slint. So this album is a super tight 29 minutes. It feels tight too. It's pretty fast paced. And the thing is, for math rock, it's rare to have such iconic riffs as Tweeze does. Of course, Spiderland has more iconic riffs, but don't knock Tweeze away because Tweeze is excellent as well. It has a super, super edgy grunge feel with really insane distortion on the guitars. And that's what's nice about this album over Spiderland. If you don't like minimalism and you don't like huge builds, instead, you get really complex bass parts, really driving guitar rhythms that just sort of pummel you into the dirt. The melodies are super gripping, and the spoken word parts all add straight atmosphere, not as much substance and storytelling as Spiderland necessarily, but it's a unique feeling altogether. The song Carol is uncharacteristically groovy, great track, and it delivers its purpose. just perfectly. And the whole second half of the album is like nail-bitingly tense, really indicating what Slint was going for on Spiderland, which followed after. I think Tweeze is another great album, a really interesting release in its own identity from Spiderland. It feels like two different monoliths. I, of course, prefer Spiderland. That's one of my favorite albums ever. But Tweeze is really its own solid thing. I mean, you could potentially view it as proto Spiderland, but I really think that's doing it a disservice because it's as excellent, not as excellent, but it's its own excellent album. And then this points to equally angry with Drive Like Jehu with Yank Crime. Now, I'll admit, at the beginning of this album, I didn't really get into it as much. It felt kind of like generic-ish post-hardcore, but eventually I could kind of see where it was going. Firstly, I wanted to say this felt louder than Queens of the Stone Age type stuff, like Songs for the Deaf. It felt buzzier, louder, more punchy, without being straight up noise rock. It felt like it really rode that line. The bass tone is really thick, too. And the rhythmic playing and the vocals, too, are very strong. So the mathiness doesn't really have a lot of presence on this album, but the song New Math really shows it off a bit more. I do like the song Super Unicorn. It's just wonderful the way that the melodies are pulled through the noisy sections. I thought that was a really nice touch, added a really interesting feeling to the track as a whole. This is a great album. Super influential for emo, post-hardcore, math rock, kind of a landmark album. And there's a reason you see it on Mew all the time, because it's feels very influential. At first I was like, this doesn't really feel as massive as people say it is, but then I got into it and I'm like, yeah, it's probably is. Meanwhile, going into less angry, we have Polvo with Today's Active Lifestyles. And this is probably the last big band we're covering on the whole chart, minus Hella. Hella has a couple more releases we'll talk about. But in terms of like your Don Caballeros or your Terra Meloses or your American Footballs, this is probably the last band of its size. And especially influence, because math rock kind of broke away into its own style with Polvo. Polvo was one of the 90s groups that really brought it into its own style. And that's what this album and the next one we'll talk about. And I'll admit, I don't like Today's Active Lifestyles as much as Exploded Drawing, and I feel like I'm the only person who thinks that. But either way, let's get into the content. So we got hints of post-hardcore and even post-punk here, but it's a lot more angular and warped than both of those styles traditionally are. I'll admit, not all of this I love, but the track Stinger is like 7 minutes of just beauty. And the bass lines are just rolling over each other, just really, really cool, just impact by one of the instruments here. It's probably the best one on the track. And I could imagine they'd be better live when they'd just be blaring down the house just with this immense noise. But I feel like listening in a non-traditional setting like that kind of does it a disservice. The track Time Isn't On My Side, I think, is a really good sort of emotional track here. Kind of brings the album back to earth and grounds it a little bit for a good emotional send-off, which I think is a nice touch that isn't really seen by the rest of the album or even the last few albums. But I think this album is good overall. I don't think it's amazing. Not all the melodies were as gripping as maybe like a Tweeze would be, but it's a solid album and kind of essential to understanding the evolution of math rock. Because this came so early, you kind of have to cover them. But if I were you, I would listen to Exploded Drawing by Polvo instead, which is the next album we actually are supposed to talk about today. Now, this has really interesting angular melodies that seem to actually progress Polvo even more into the math rock that we know and love if you love math rock a little more than I do. Now, it's not as dense, it's a bit softer for a lot of it, but it doesn't try to be as loud as Today's Active Lifestyles. Today's Active Lifestyles feels like it's trying to go so hard, but this album carves its own identity, and it's not afraid to be softer a lot of the time, but when it goes hard, it goes hard. And it's mainly, more than anything else, groove oriented. It's got groove to it, which is just a nice feature that has been missing for a while. But the track Feather of Forgiveness is brutally harsh. It's probably one of my favorite Polvo tracks. There's a lot of range here between the lighter melodies and the bone-crushing growls from the bass. Also, the last track is 11 minutes in length, which is pretty solid. It has a good sense of progression. I know I say that for a lot of longer tracks here, but I could see why that would happen, because I mean, all of these people are recommending, or whoever made this chart recommended this. I'd hope all the long songs are here, have a good sense of progression. Except Animals self-titled, that album can get out of here, man. I don't care for that album very much. And finally, to end this corner, with the album that could easily go into American football, Chavez with Ride the Fader. I'll admit, I love this album. It felt a little bit like Fang Island to me, which Fang Island self-titled was one of my favorite albums on this chart. But this one is just sublime. With its storytelling, its vocals are awesome. The melodies are really interesting, sometimes with a little bit of dissonance too. Harmonies. Sorry, I meant harmonies. Because the vocalists, two of them, harmonize at different points. There's also a ton of energy in the singing, and this feels a lot like it's drawing from 90s alt style vocals and other alt isms of the time. And the guitar tone is really awesome and noisy, which I love the noisy guitar tones. I mean, don't get me wrong, those are phenomenal, but here it's given like an emotional edge to it. Stylistically, all these elements coming together comes out of nowhere. It's almost like the past like 50 albums didn't even touch this. Tied Around the Jaws is pretty much noise rock, with how just like punchy it is and how much it just blocks out your brain with noise. It's like suffocating. The song Lions is super emotional, and I think the guitar lines, especially on that track, are even more emotional than albums like American Football 1, and I'll stand by that. I think this is a better album than American Football 1. Sure, it doesn't have Never Met's guitar line, but as a whole, it's just punchier, and it's more emotionally fulfilling, and it's got a little bit of bitterness to it, which I can understand more. So that is the math rock part. That's the last one of the whole year. Kind of funny saying that, because like, I mean, I got a couple months left, but the thing is, I know what I'm doing for those. I hope you guys will enjoy those, because it's a total left turn from what I've been covering for the past several months. As in, there's no math rock, but I have some plans. Don't you guys worry. That's bad. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys enjoyed me talking about math rock in 2021. Hopefully I can move on to something else come February. I have a couple ideas, but that I think some of you will enjoy. But that's it's my content. So I mean, if you have any recommendations for stuff, I'll maybe talk about it. Doesn't mean I'll love it, but I love to hear you guys recommend stuff. That's one of my favorite things on this channel. Not that I get it that much, but you know what? Communication is key, and I always appreciate it. But that's about it. Hope you guys are doing well out there. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe. Any comments, questions, or concerns, go ahead and comment down below. My Instagram, Discord server, and Twitter are all in the description. Please join the Discord server. People still churn out stuff every once in a while. There's like one guy who will like be gone for like a month, and then he'll post like 4 albums in a day, which I always love that stuff. But I'm posting albums there. You guys can post albums there too. That's about it. Hope you guys are doing well. Have a good one. Bye.